Hi, this is Ashishar Bidekar and welcome to my podcast, The ARB Show. I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, Raj. Raj is a serial entrepreneur having built multiple startups with three venture-backed successful exits. He's currently head of Solo at Mozilla. Solo is an AI website builder for solo entrepreneurs. It is a part of the Mozilla new product group. Raj enjoys building great products. He excels at user experience, identifying insights, execution, and leading and mentoring teams. As I said earlier, he was previously with multi VC backed founder CEO with exits to companies like Mozilla, Salesforce, and others, where Raj has taken personal pain points to products in markets with tens of millions of users and teams that he has scaled from one person to teams of teams. He has some excellent insights on product management, being a practitioner. It's really gives me a great pleasure. Thank you, Raj, for being a guest on the show. I look forward to hearing your insights on top 5 tips for product managers. Over to you, Raj.
Thank you, Ashish. That was the most textbook intro I've ever had. How do you want me to go through this? Just kind of talk through the tips?
Yeah, you can talk to one tip and we can kind of go one tip over the next.
Okay. All right. So I'll just, again, appreciate being on the show. You'd asked for me to share some tips. Now, distilling it down to 5 was non-trivial, and it was kind of what just came to mind. I'm sure there's dozens of other things that you've just sort of learned through working. First tip I'll share here, we are definitely in the Gen AI era. And so something I actively do is constantly try to figure out new ways to use my Copilot, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, whatever it is, to basically replace my lower leverage work so I can focus on higher leverage things. The macro here is I think the super IC is the future, and everybody's job, no matter what occupation, is to figure out how to automate yourself. Okay. And as part of doing that, that'll make you more strategic in where you spend your time. But that also means you can start doing more and more things, boosting obviously your own productivity. And so that's an archetype I generally look for.
Right.
The way I sort of succinctly wrote that down here was, as a product manager in 2024, part of your job is to figure out how to replace yourself.
Right. So here that's a very interesting point, because I just realized there was a kind of a viral post by a meta engineer who said that after using Cursor, I think was using Cursor for some coding work, his view was that with AI, 80% of his skills of coding will be relegated to the background because that won't be required. But at the same time, the remaining 20% of the skills have to be a 10x value in terms of the output, in terms of the quality. For example, like deep thought, architecture, or deep insights of industry or your experience, which are distilled and put, that would kind of really make it interesting. Another thing, when you mentioned it, also just reflecting on couple of business guru speak. So you would recollect many years back there used to be a fad, or there used to be a trend called business process reengineering, right? Change everything, do a business process reengineering. And there, I think it was Michael Hammy, I think that's one of the gurus who wrote that famous HBR piece. And what he said, that don't automate, obliterate, right? Automation will only make things faster, but unless you have got the basics and unless you have spent quality time in the basics, it's not really going to make things any better. So that fits in nicely with what you said, that you can use AI to kind of free many of those onerous manual tasks, but at the same time you have to upskill yourself in the deep insights or deep thinking as a product manager. So that's really fantastic. So what are some of the other tips you would like to share?
Sure. And I did have some comments.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. The 80-20% analogy that you used. So I use this 95% analogy with AI, which is basically, let's always assume it's only 95% accurate. So it should be, so therefore, what are the best applications of AI? Like, for example, If you told me it should schedule my meetings and it gets one or two of them wrong, that's mission critical workflow. I can't afford that. And so therefore I'll choose a manual experience. But if you told me it's providing research with links and they may not be precise, but it's generally just trying to educate me, that's great. That's a great use case. And so I get the notion of the meta engineer talking about the 80-20 case. However, what I would say is, it absolutely is providing insight and background and helping me think through how maybe I want to architect something if I'm doing something from a coding perspective, or rather how I even think about two different markets and how I should approach it, or how I should insert myself, or how I should compete. So I wouldn't restrict myself from an 80-20 perspective. There are people I know who are building full-blown applications with Gen AI, which is probably on one extreme of the bell curve, but you can definitely see the trend line. But the meta point here is you have to be a consummate learner, and you have to be thinking about how to use these tools to accelerate yourself, because the super IC is real. So the second tip I wrote down here is making the wrong decision is better than deferring the decision. This sounds so simple. This is like one of the most common probably statements you probably have read in books, and it's crazy how often I see it happen repeatedly, and I think it's one of those things where it's sort of you have to live through it, and you make the same mistake again and again, and then you reflect on it, and you're like, wow, that's exactly what I did. And so there's this thing in venture with startups about companies that raise less money versus a lot of money, and often you'll hear investors say that raising less is better. And there's a lot of other reasons that raising less might be better. But one of the reasons is it forces you to make decisions. You can't do A and B if you don't have enough capital to do A and B. So you have to either do A or B. The worst case is you do neither and you just defer the decision, which is often the case. And that's often that doesn't help anybody, because now you're not learning if A or B was a good or bad decision, as well as you have a team around you that's operating in this state of like uncertainty, because there isn't strong conviction around anything, and so you're just sort of building. And this applies to whether it's features on a product, whether it's positioning statements in terms of your TAM, whether it's product lines, strategies, like all over the place. Is just choose. And I always tell people, if you're wrong, that's great, because at least you learned it's wrong, and now you can go change directions. And so the only thing to really keep in mind here is one-way door versus two-way door decisions. One-way door decisions, it's hard to go back. You make a specific architectural decision, and that's kind of it. You can't really change it ever again. But that is not an excuse to sort of delay the decision. So the tip there is making the wrong decision is better than deferring the decision.
Right. So it also, there's a similar statement which says that not taking any risk is the biggest risk, right? For example, if you're trying to say that, okay, I could be wrong, and you want to get more data or get more information before you increase your confidence, it's very likely that even if you take the decision, there would be some aspect which you have missed out. So that's a very relevant decision. And I liked what you said, that think of decisions from a one-way or a two-way door perspective. So that forces you to take decisions. So would you say that in terms of workflow, etc., internally teams decide on a deadline and say that, okay, with whatever we have got, either it's A or a B, but we will decide on this day, and you kind of put it on stone and just go with it?
I don't generally operate with so I think this is touching like three different things, and I think it's case by case. So one thing is definitely in a startup environment, and most of my perspective is startup, you have to make decisions quickly. Each of these delays is compounding. And 10 minutes here, 5 hours there, 2 days, 3 days there. I'm not one to say, oh, I'm going to schedule a decision by next Thursday. It'll be more like, I want to gather this data and we'll make a decision. That could be like in the next day, it could be the next 2-3 days. But the case I'm talking about is really where next Thursday comes along and you're like, you know what, we want to spend 2-3 more weeks analyzing this. And then we want to spend 2-3 more weeks. And that's where you start entering this sort of, you start going into analysis paralysis. But really what it's showing is you don't have conviction around either of these paths. But you really just need to make a decision because the team is now floundering because they're going in circles. They're not sure. And this can be sort of a vicious, like a trap. You're just burning money. But to your comment earlier, I also want to add with taking risk, very common pattern I see is you're building a new startup and you see startup X out in the ether, like one of your competitors, like just raise a bunch of money or doing A, B, and C, and they look like they're crushing it. And so then naturally you want to copy. It's like, hey, we should do what they're doing. Look at how they're positioning. And I have learned through multiple startups that if I do the same thing everybody else does, then I should expect the same result. So what I mean by that is you're going to expect a mediocre outcome. And so often I feel like one of the most common mistakes with startups is not taking enough risk. You raised money to take risk. We need to have outsized outcomes. We're not here to show linear growth. We're here to find step functions. If we don't find those step functions, it's fine. We fail. But at least we gave it a shot. What I do know is if you just play a linear game, especially not as the incumbent or not the first to market, your odds of success are way, way lower. So, the ultimate goal here is to maximize luck scenarios. I call that roll enough bowling balls, eventually get a strike. And so we're trying to maximize that. And so we got to play high risk games.
Got it. So that's very, very valid and a very insightful comment. Moving on to the third tip, what would you say is a third tip which product managers should look out for?
Yeah, so what I wrote down here is your goal as a PM is to craft an experience that is simple enough that no user education is required. Now, some people think that's crazy, right? Like you play with Salesforce, you go through an onboarding experience, you go through a post-onboarding experience, and you get sent to like tutorial videos and more, and then they usually have a customer success person, and sure, fine. But I think the goal should be to get to a point where there is no user education required. The app is so simple, and most of my experiences, actually, frankly, all my experiences have been consumer. And so I am thinking about the broad-based masses, all users, and they should be able to just see it and get it. This era of like coach marks, this era of like post-onboarding pop-up flows or wizards or journeys or tutorials or whatever you want to call it, I think it's gone. Who actually looks at those things? Everybody hits skip, everybody closes them. And so we really, people want to get into the experience, they want to start playing with it. And so I think we really have to, I think as a PM, I call this editing, simplifying, narrowing, whatever you want to call it. It's a key skill because part of this also is you're going to have to make a bunch of decisions that you don't want to make, right? And a natural reaction is like, if we built it, we should show it, right? But the reality is 95% of the users are only using one thing. So the whole workflow should be thing as a feature, as we know. But I think ultimately the only way to get, the part of this focus around eliminate user education, get it so simple, is it makes you make hard decisions around feature bloat and all this other stuff that people aren't using and whether you should just bury it or get rid of it. So it's all about that focus.
So any specific companies which you would highlight as benchmarks? I mean, of course, Apple comes to mind, but any specific companies where you think that the PMs have done a fantastic job, it's simple, easy, elegant, and very user-focused.
Well, yeah, so, you say Apple has done a fantastic job. I mean, I don't know, right? Like, so for example, some of their products seem just so simple, like setting up an AirTag, the user journey, like you go through that, like there was no user education required. It was just so simple. But if you're trying to set up like anything around parental controls, like limiting, device time and things like that, it's really complicated. So many settings, so many options. And I know they're probably struggling with it and beating their head on it. Like, how do I make this simpler? So I think you hear about this with different companies, but there are marvelous onboarding flows through some apps where, it's like 3 clicks and you're just kind of in the app. I actually recently built something called GPT Food Cam just for fun on the side over some weekends this summer. But the whole idea was to take an otherwise really crowded app experience, everything around calorie logging. Most of them take you through 10-step onboarding journeys where they ask about goals and what you want to do and whatnot, to something that was just like 1 click. Like you kind of open the app, it just opens straight into a camera. You just take a photo of your food and you're done. And so, the goal here is to simplify, no user education required, and then people just feel the delight.
Perfect. I mean, this is also similar to what is told in, in websites or internet, that every additional click means less number of people, a loss of customers, right? At every stage. So it
definitely in onboarding, you can use like the 90%. This is basically the 10% drop-off rule. So you can kind of just multiply it across. That's not an uncommon rule. It depends on the app, depends how much intent there is, depends if it's B2B versus B2C, mobile versus web, and where obviously, or if they came through ads versus came in through, organic word of mouth, you're going to get different intent, right? But
right.
But I'm not talking about just onboarding flows. I'm talking about the core experience itself.
Core experience. So in fact, you remember when Tempo AI was kind of shut down, I actually wrote back to you saying that, hey, I'm missing it. So that's from a user perspective, I think that was a very elegant app what you had made. And once you kind of start missing the app in your daily workflow, that's when I think is the best kind of testimonial to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the NPS, right? That's sort of
true. So let's move on.
This app. Yeah.
Exactly. So let's move on. So what are the last two tips which you would like to share?
So tip number 4, I wrote, winning PMs optimize on velocity. And so, there was a quote from an old VP of product at Google, early days, this is like 20 years ago, that said something like, we're expensive routers as PMs. Our job is to route and make sure things are unblocked. And I very much resonate with that quote. And maybe it's because I've been in startups my whole life, but I think our only advantages, and I do feel that the tech itself is not a moat or a defensible advantage anymore. I think our only advantage is speed, show high velocity. Larger companies can't do that velocity, whether it's just simply the meeting culture, whether it's other sort of things they have to work through, legal departments, privacy policy, who knows, right? Data collection, whatever. But being able to kind of plow through all of that is as a startup is a massive advantage. Skipping over or whatever it is, and so velocity is something that's hard for other people to compete against. And so just keep shipping, keep high velocity. I think it's critical. It's actually something I did. I'm at Mozilla. We launched this product called Solo, which I'm responsible for, which is an AI website creator. But we built sort of a case study around it within Mozilla itself because of how fast we got this out there. Very much because we operated in a silo from the larger company. So I practice what I'm writing here in terms of tips, but yeah, speed above all else.
Right. Also, I think once you have velocity, it also helps you to get an initial feedback or other things which at point of time would always be on your drawing boards, right? Because nothing like when the rubber meets the road, and the sooner you do that, the better is the time you get feedback, either positive or negative, and then you can double down or take correctives. So from in the larger scheme of things, velocity would be definitely a moat, as you said.
Yeah, so what I tell people too, actually, when it comes to feedback, you definitely learn different things at different numbers of users. I actually used to joke and call it small feedback, medium feedback, or big feedback. You don't have to necessarily use these terms, but basically, the things you learn at, like, let's say your beta group at 100 users is very different to the things you learn once you're in the tens of thousands of users, which actually is also quite different to the things you learn in the hundreds of thousands or millions of users. And a lot of that is just because the audiences actually change. You have a very early adopter, friendly TAM early on. The next thing you know, you have these masses across a range of use cases or whatnot. And again, I'm talking about consumer apps. And so the types of things you learn do change, and they have an impact on the user experience, because all of a sudden you see at the millions that there's this confusion around this particular part of the experience which you never saw before.
Great. So what would be your concluding tip, Raj?
So the 5th tip I wrote here is too many PMs are too data driven. So This may sound super counterintuitive because, like, what are you talking about, Raj? Like, we're always told data above all else. I think there was also this quote at Google. I can't remember. I'm paraphrasing, so I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's like data doesn't care about your emotions or something of that nature. And I very much resonate with that. I mean, I understand data, how critical data can be. However, I think if you were to plot the importance of data versus the stage of the product, I don't think it's one-to-one. And what I mean by that is when you are starting very early, 0 to, let's say, 3.x of your product, you actually don't have a lot of data. Particularly 0 to 1, you have almost no data. You have a small number of users or just testers or whatever it is. So you have to have a hypothesis on what you want to build, and you have to have conviction around that. And you need to have strong enough conviction that you're willing to say, hey, even if XYZ user says this or that, I believe, and I'm willing to give it 3 years to figure it out. Right? So, and plow down this path that may not be ideally suited for every one of those users that you're talking or interviewing or whatnot. And so, as you get to 1.x, 2.x, 3.x, A/B testing is a privilege. People talk about, oh, well, A/B test takes a lot of time. You have to build the test. You have to probably use some framework or third party to go you do that with. A lot of people are using StatSig now. People in the past, there's sort of multiple vendors like Optimizely, etc. But you have to set all that up. It's expensive. It takes time, and you got to put it out. You have to have enough users to actually be statistically interesting. And then you run thousands of tests, and you only get a 1% improvement. That's a game post 3.x, right? Like you do all these tests because you're trying to squeeze. But in the beginning, you're really looking for step functions, high risk, as I said. So the meta comment around this tip is really have a hypothesis and then work towards it. And it may not totally align with what you say or even the data, but if you believe in it, then you should plow forward. With Solo that we built at Mozilla, very much believe that there is a TAM for just a simpler website builder based on AI, and that's what we're trying to prove. And so that's how we're approaching it.
On the same point, right? Here you mentioned that it's a website builder, right? And there are many website builders in the market. What are the specific things which you did differently when you started building out? Because again, it would be the whole hypothesis of, okay, this is what we should achieve as the initial product 1.0. And of course, because it's not a new solution to a problem, I'm sure there would be lots of ideas and lots of things as to, okay, this is what we should do, this is what we should not do, this is what the data shows. How do you filter and decide, okay, this data is relevant for this stage and this is not? How did you do that sifting?
Well, so the hypothesis around Solo was that the service provider segment was underserved. So Shopify is the e-commerce segment, Wix and Squarespace are your general website segment, WordPress, etc. is kind of your developer segment. But the service provider segment, coaches, tutors, consultants, they didn't have a vertical experience or a solution that's sort of out there. And we've stayed true to that hypothesis, even though our data may actually say otherwise. So our data says, hey, there's tons of users wanting to use this like an e-commerce site. There's tons of users wanting to use this like a homepage. And they're asking for X, Y, and Z. But we're not necessarily supporting what they're asking for. We're still looking at it purely from the lens of what do service providers need. And, we want to give this a fair shot. You could easily fall into this trap where you just kind of move where your users move. And the next thing you know, you've built everything. And you're going to look like one of those products with like thousands of options. And it doesn't have any core audience. And those products usually will end up stuck in some sort of purgatory state, spinning, but they won't show that kind of growth. So our conviction is we believe that the service provider segment needs, sort of a vertical experience, beginning with the website and back office tools and whatnot. And so that's what we're focused on. And then, of course, Gen AI is sometimes you get lucky, right? The technology works well with the market timing. And so in this case, Gen AI really makes it a lot easier because it reduces all the friction. It creates a simple experience, generates the text, curates your images, and so forth. So that's kind of how we landed with the hypothesis thesis around Mozilla Solo.
Got it. And I like what you talked about, the too much feature bloat or feature bloatware and going straight into purgatory. Because in many cases I'm reminded of, let's say, very simple software like Excel or Word, right? Possibly you just use less than 5%, less than even 1% of all the features or all the tools, right? And that's I think a global thing. But in terms of, with every release, the kind of sophisticated functions, etc., there, you really don't know how much is really getting used. So, and that takes time, right? A behemoth like Microsoft can afford that, but for a startup just to go into the chasing features is something which is not something useful. Thank you, Raj. This gives a great perspective and very deep insights. And thank you to listeners for tuning in. To subscribe, share, and like this podcast. Consider giving it a 5-star rating if you like the content. Bye for now. Talk to you soon.